Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Steph. Good on you. We'll start as we did with the other field day with a welcome to country. So I'd like to acknowledge the Wiradjuri people who are the traditional custodians of the land. I'd like to pay respect to elders past and present of the Wiradjuri nation and extend that respect to other Indigenous Australians who are present. I did mention in the last seminar that I've been actually learning a bit of Wiradjuri language from a local Wiradjuri chap. I've come up with a phrase, Dagun Nanana, which means to care for soil, and Nurambang Nanana, to care for country. And I think it's a good enough overview of what this project that we're doing here at the moment, the Carbon Calling Virtual Field Day series, is come out of a group of growers that got together with SoilCQuest, funded by the Australian Government Smart Farms Grant, Ian Potter Foundation, with in-kind contributions from ANU and 4 or 5 land care groups around the district. The Soils Climate Resilient Soils Network was born a couple of years ago. COVID has got in the way with some of our research, but we pushed on this year and got trials in the ground. And part of that process was to report on what we're up to out in the paddock. The framework of the research to basically engage growers that are doing interesting and innovative work, and to start putting some science around that towards ways that we can increase soil carbon in cropping systems in this instance. So soil carbon in cropping, in an annualised cropping system, it's easy to lose and it's hard to build. So any systems that can actually move the meter on, move the needle on soil carbon in cropping systems, we're really interested in doing. Obviously for multifaceted reasons of soil health, soil fertility, resilience in changing seasons, and also every kilo, every tonne of carbon dioxide we can pull out of the atmosphere and put into the soil also helps to mitigate climate change. So today, you come along with the second one in the series. I see we've got quite a few more on here today than we did last time. I think it was 51 last time, and there'll be some new faces coming on board today. So I thought it was wise just to give some of that background on what we're actually doing here. We've got a good lineup here today. We're at Stuart McDonald's property. Well, Stuart's at Stuart McDonald's property. If we're in a real field day, we'd all be there and eating sausage sandwiches and having a cuppa. Instead, we're relegated to the Zoom room. But Stu's braved the weather. It's misty rain and a bit chill, but he's out there in the paddock. Hopefully, they'll have enough bars on his mobile phone to give us a bit of a look at the paddock and what we're up to there. We've also got David Hardwick here today. David's an old friend from many years. David and I have knocked around the bush and crossed paths. David's an excellent speaker on soil health, all things soil health, but particularly today he's going to be talking about the trials that are actually in the paddock is around compost applications, mycorrhizal inoculation, and the two of those together, and working out what are the principles at play there that may increase soil carbon. We're lucky enough to have Professor Justin Borovich and Dr. Wolfram Buss from the Australian National University with us today to talk about the recalcitrance of carbon, the longevity of carbon, and the different fractions of carbon that are in the soil. So it's like that old ad, oils ain't oils, for those who are old enough to remember that ad. It's soils ain't soils and carbon ain't carbon. There's a whole range of things to look at there in the different fractions of carbon that exist in our soil. So we've been working with those guys down at the ANU to work through some of that new science. At the end, there'll be a panel discussion. So we'll all open the floor up to questions and hopefully get a really lively conversation going. So without further ado, we might, Steph, you've got a video there to play. So we've been capturing some of the stuff happening out in the paddock through the season on video. So we'll just play a little 2-minute video and then we will we'll go for a bit of a conversation with Stuart actually out in the paddock. So over to you, Steph.
Just checking that everyone can see that.
Yep.
We're here. Yeah, my name's Stuart McDonald. I live at Canoundra and we farm on 1,400 hectares here that in a zero-till system that we've adopted 2 years ago, moving from minimum till, and growing wheat, canola, chickpeas, experimenting with the fit for multi-species forages. We have livestock in merino sheep and cattle on the place, and we use those to graze both our crops and permanent pastures. Guy approached us this year and said he had some mycorrhizal fungi that he wanted to coat our seed with and see if there was any effect compared to bare seed. That was also done in combination with some compost that was spread on areas of the paddock. So 2/4 of the paddock had compost, and alternate strips of the wheat paddock had the mycorrhizal fungi coated on the wheat seed. Being part of what Guy's doing, it's about normalising the benefits of carbon and seeing the agronomic benefits of that. I'm very aware of the agronomic benefits of having carbon, but less familiar with how I can reliably and consistently add carbon to my program without costing me a whole season with a green manure crop. So I think being part of what Guy's doing is pretty exciting. I think he's doing great things, and I think it would just increases our confidence to know that this is what works in our environment, and we can replicate this and apply it more broadly.
Thanks, Stuart, for those kind words. It was good. It's really nice to be able to take a bit of video in a good season. 18-19 wouldn't have looked so glorious as it does there now. It really does look a picture over there at Stu's place. Stu, the people that are involved, I guess, in this Climate Resilient Soils Network, we've kind of cherry-picked a little bit because they're people that are looking at complete systems, putting whole packages together in their farming programs. And I was reading an article yesterday about comparing the way that we're thinking about building soil carbon. If you're a banker, you want to commoditize something, you want to put it in a little unit box and sell that box on to the next person, sort of thing. You want to unitize it. So they want you to stock the soil in the ground and lock it away and throw away the key, sort of thing. But in the farming game, that's not really how it works. You're more managing the economy of the carbon. That's more, a grow and flow sort of scenario. So it's building carbon in the soil is more about adopting a system than any particular one strategy and maintaining that system over time to build carbon. And it's certainly what attracted SoilCQuest to your operation with pushing the boundaries, having a look at different things. Particularly, we'll get to the actual trial that's on the paddock there in a minute, but I'd like to tease out a little bit more about your experience with cover crops, in particular multi-species cover crops and single species cover crops, because I know you've hosted a GRDC trial on the property and you've played around with it yourself. What are your thoughts there as integrating cover crops into the annual cropping system?
Thanks, Guy. Is my audio working okay at that? Is that
excellent?
Yep. Yeah, good. I've been interested in it since 2018 and doing some travel with a Nuffield scholarship where I was exposed in America and Europe to the benefits of cover cropping with people that have been doing no-till and covers for a number of years. I hadn't seen any of that work done locally. I came back and thought, right, I'm into it. I'm trying this. And so first summer, I put a multi-species cover in with our FlexiCoil time machine, and we had some success, but it was really clear to me straight away that we were going to dry the ground out in our environment too much in summer to reliably establish covers. So for covers to establish reliably, I think we had to make the transition to discs. Discs also fitted the idea that we weren't going to be burning carbon every time we went over the ground planting a crop. The scope here with we're in a very similar environment to Luke yesterday, and with the non-seasonal distribution of our rainfall, we can pretty reliably get a cover established most seasons. So the idea is we have to get it in though pretty quick because it does get hot, and get it established. So that's where the discs fitted into that. And with the last couple of years, we've really found we haven't been using all our moisture. There's just been the rolling averages just went over 900 mil, I think, for the last 12 months recently. So it's just been very kind seasons, and we're finding the soil can't hold the water and it's running off, and it's breaking out in some soakage areas, which I see as a lost opportunity for both.
Yep.
Yeah.
And that's one thing you saw in, you pulled quite a big crowd on the day a couple of years ago with that GADC trial with the cropping termination timing. So doing cover cropping and terminating it at different points to see how that would impact the summer fallow moisture. Did you want to give a bit of a high level overview of what that research found?
Well, from what I took from what Cole did there was the ability to grow high biomass crops, mainly cereals, so like sorghums, millets, and there was also the ability to grow legumes. They didn't seem to do the bulk, but we thought they might in the summer, even though the rain was reasonably kind to them. But they didn't seem to fix as much nitrogen as I thought they would. But so the focus then became, well, if we can grow biomass, we need to monetize that biomass, and we need to put it in a mix that's palatable to stock. It's really hard to graze large areas of sorghum or millet over summer effectively if it's growing. When it starts to grow, it grows by the day, or by the hour almost, not by the day. So it grows very quickly. So we need to be able to smash it down and utilize it while it's in that perfect growth stage. So I think for me, the message was to grow biomass, try and utilize it. And if we can grow biomass and even if you dry the profile out to 50 centimeters, that extra root mass and that soil will then be in a position to take in the next lot of rainfall so much quicker than a bare soil would have. So the recharge was pretty startling to see that almost straight line recharge going on where there was a heavy load of organic matter.
Yeah, and that's the exciting thing that I saw too. That I took away the same information, that's that ability for the soil to take on rain events and for that rain not to disappear off the property. And Mick Wettenhall's on the call here now, but he's coined the phrase when one farmer's talking to the other and say, "How much rain did you get?" You want to be able to say all of it.
Exactly.
And don't let any off your place. So that recharge numbers off that trial were quite impressive, and I think that's what it's all about. It's roots not only put carbon back in the ground, but they also put pathways down into your subsoil, and you want to be storing that water down in your subsoil. Don't want to be storing it up the top because it can wick out and dry out quite easily there. But you want to get it right down deep in the bucket. Down in the subsoil, and the only way to do that is to actually create physical channels down into that subsoil, and it's doing that at working out what that cost benefit ratio is of when to terminate and what the season is going to be like. But so I guess that's the art of farming. But it was really interesting that you've had both experiences of just doing cover cropping in the cropping system, but also integrating livestock. And I'd be interested in your comments on the role of livestock in these kind of productive carbon building systems in your mind or your experience.
Well, and my experience has largely been framed around what we did in 18 and 19, which wasn't much, unfortunately. In 19, we've transitioned into a new machine. So we weren't really set up, 20, we weren't really set up to start this summer with a lot of covers, but it would have been a perfect season to do that. And I think the extra carrying capacity you can get out of that with quick controlled grazers of high stocking rates can not only give you some value out of the cover crop, but also do some really good things for the soil. It'll smash a bit of that biomass down to the ground. It'll introduce biology that's not there currently. With the animals they're carrying around in their gut, and I think it's it's part of the way we can rebuild some of our soils. I think with livestock, I think without livestock, it's probably a harder road, but I think livestock gives us that opportunity to directly take some benefit from a cover crop that's grown on opportunistic rain.
Great stuff. Might we're always on a time schedule with these Zoom calls, so we'll keep chugging along. I might get you to give us a little bit of a virtual tour through the wheat crop. I think you might have picked some plants out or something and just spend a couple of minutes explaining what we've done here. We did cover it in the video a little bit, but it's good to see it in real time, what the crop's actually looking like.
Sure. Sure.
If we've got enough bars to do it.
Yeah, well, I just pulled up some plants. The two on the outside are packed area where we probably truck the compost in. The paddocks, that's not a great place to pull it up and look at root samples, compost, but I'm not sure whether it's the mycorrhizal fungi or not, because I'm not sure of the plan. But
so what have we got?
But sorry, which one?
What are we looking at there? Sorry, on the left-hand side through to the right-hand side.
Sorry, yep. So left is compost, and not sure whether it's mycorrhizal fungi or not, but that's also compost. And this one, no compost.
Okay. Yeah.
I suppose I was just trying to see, and when you look at it closely, pan around to give you an idea of the crop.
So it's
I might have great service. Yeah, the crop's looking good. It's a Beckham variety of wheat, which usually looks terrible prior to putting a header into it. But this year's looking as good as I've seen it look. So, yeah, it'll be interesting to see whether we can see on the yield data whether there's any compost difference and mycorrhizal difference across the board. We should be able to tell with alternate strips of mycorrhizal fungi and the compost in 2/4 of the paddock whether there's been any difference, hopefully.
Great. Well, on that note, we might flick over to, thanks very much for that, Stuart. That was excellent. We might go to David Hardwick now. So Dave's going to tease out what we might be looking at there. And we have got the ANU team standing by for us to send soil samples back down to Canberra and measure the carbon levels, measure the fractions, mycorrhizal colonisation, so that we can, unfortunately, we haven't got that data here yet because it's not the end of the season, but we've done baselines on that paddock, and at the end of the season, we'll retest and see if we've made any gains. But I'll flick over to Dave. He's got some pretty good pictures there, but he might tease out how these principles come into play. Thanks, David. Over to you.
Thanks, Guy, and thanks, Stuart, for that. Yeah, I've probably going to leave you guys with more questions than answers by the end of this one. But anyway, see how we go. Yeah, no, thanks for having us. And I really enjoyed the last session. So anyone who missed last session, it's really worth watching that video. It was a great session. I guess what I'll do in this 10 minutes or so is, yeah, just more show you some paddock examples of not just mycorrhizal fungi and compost, but this whole challenge we have of rebuilding soils. I've got this photo here, which is 2008 in Hermidale, West of Nyngan, a wheat crop, a young wheat crop. That's a biological farmer. Back in the day when Guy and me were chomping around in the early days of biological agronomy. I like this photo because it's really highlighting, obviously, this challenge we have, which is what are the pathways to increasing soil carbon in cropping systems, in low rainfall cropping systems. And that second question, which we were kind of trying to deal with in our own way back then too, I guess, Guy, which is, can biologicals help us in this process, if I use that broader term? And I think the answer is that it's more complex, but it's great to see you guys doing very specific paddock trials. So I'll keep rolling. The other thing that I'm going to do in this is bring you some examples from North Queensland. So Guy, you mentioned that you thought I might be up in North Queensland. For the last 7 years, I have spent pretty much about nearly half of of my time, literally doing extension along particularly the wet tropics of Queensland in the sugarcane farming systems and communities, and also grazing and tropical fruits. But they've had a lot of money because of the Great Barrier Reef, which they fortunately live next to, and unfortunately means that they're now legislated in how they manage their soil. But the other thing about the cane industry is that it was probably the first major widespread or main industry in Australia to really investigate and research soil biology, soil carbon, soil health. They were forced to. They had a yield decline nationally across cane from New South Wales right through to Mossman in the wet tropics, and by the late 80s they were plateauing and in fact going backwards the more inputs they used. So they put a 13-year R&D project into it, very significant, and they really spent a lot of focus on soil biology, soil health, etc., soil carbon. So I think there's some really good lessons that other areas of Australia can learn from. So I'm really keen to share that, just one, because they're pretty amazing farmer systems and there's some amazing farmers up there. So I'm going to call this presentation Essentials plus Compost and Mycorrhizal Fungi, and I'm going to spend a fair bit of time on the essentials, not that we have lots of time. So I guess I do want to just start with a little quiz, and this is a quote from my current favourite book. There is no need to be pessimistic about soil when soil making can be rapid and cheap. I'm not sure I 100% agree with that, but I'm kind of halfway there. While it is true that only 1/10 of the Earth's surface is covered with soil, and not too much of this could be classed as highly fertile, it has to be realised that agriculture itself can be a soil making process. So that is from 1954. So I'm going to see who gets that by the end of this presentation. So agriculture itself can be a soil making process, which is, I think, the business we're in here now, that in our modern high production farming systems, can we reboot or rebuild soils? And obviously carbon is at the heart of that, while being productive and profitable. So I guess Guy's sort of mentioned it quite a few times through the presentation previously in this one. We're trying to build a soil system. I use the term soil system, and for me, it's a fundamentally different way of looking at soils. And that system, to a great extent, can do what we call self-organize. So the roots in relationship with the minerals and the soil microbes and the symbiotic organisms and the soil insects and the air and water can kind of arrange itself, if you like, into a high-functioning soil. It does need some help sometimes, obviously, if all four wheels fall off, you've got to put some wheels back on. But the system overall can self-organize. This is a cane field. I'll show you a picture in a little bit of a side-by-side. This is a multi-species cover managed no-till regenerative cane farmer. Ray Zamora is his name, and there's a great video on Ray if you do want to check him out. The first cane farmer in the world probably to do a crop roll, a multi-species cover down and plant cane all in the one pass. So we're talking really innovative stuff. And I've used the 5 elements of a soil system: air, water, soil life, which obviously includes fungi, soil minerals and plants. I haven't used the word organic matter because I think that's one of the fundamental changes we've had in the last 10 years is we used to think, all right, we've got trash or litter on the surface, and that's, organic matter feeding the soil. But we now know that it's the growing roots of living plants and the rhizodeposition and those other activities that living plants do. That's probably more important in arranging and optimizing this soil and putting carbon in the show. So just to give you some context for some of the stories, and I do have some cropping pictures more as well down in our neck of the woods. But yeah, this is the wet tropics, cane land, basically. And this is pineapples. There are other crops growing, some niche crops, but basically you're in the tropics. It's warm all the year round. You get 4 meters of rain. The microbes are just happy. So they break down everything and it all gets breathed back into the air. So we're dealing with soils that can have an aluminium content of 50, 60% exchangeable aluminium. So they can be quite challenging, but the challenge of building carbon in intensive cropping is the same as what we have here in the dryland cropping zones where Stuart is and where we're talking about. But it's this challenge of how do we build soil carbon? And I just thought I'd throw this picky in because you can, if you have a look carefully at that topsoil or the A horizon, it's a bit messy because of the excavator toweling up the side, but it's what they call a Daintree sand. This is north of Mossman near the Daintree River. And you can see it's actually a coastal peat. So it's a very high carbon soil that they turn from swamps into cane land in the early days. So just refreshing again, that key principle that was really well highlighted by Dr. Sue last time, and that is, I guess, when we're talking about building soil carbon, it's really just the amount of biomass you grow, the quantity plus the quality, and that's where the legumes and that quality of the biomass is critical. Above ground and below ground, that's the first key part of it, I guess. The second key part of it is your respiration oxidation, i.e. the breakdown and loss of carbon as a gas. That's what respiration and oxidation is, versus the formation of humus. Now, I know that's a big word that covers so many things, and the guys at the end of the presentation will probably tease that out more, but I'm just going to call it long-term carbon. So it's really how much is going in and the quality of it going in above ground and below ground, and how much is going back as a gas and how much is stabilizing, really. And you can see here, this is a complete contrast, to the previous slide, which is a rainforest in North Queensland, where the organic carbon percentage, even on quite low fertility granite soils, can be 12%. So they're forming what we call a forest soil pattern. Here is this is in the Dimbula irrigation area west of Cairns. This is Rhodes grass. So generally the theory is when we grow perennial pasture, when we have a pasture phase in a cropping system, the roots of the perennial grasses will build organic matter, help with structure, etc. This is an example where that's not happening. It's a Rhodes grass, hay production irrigated paddock. It should have a good root system and therefore have a reasonable amount of carbon. Because it's bombed with urea to grow the grass and it's warm and hot and there's compaction because of the haymaking machinery, the carbon levels in these paddocks, and I've seen them across from central Queensland right through, they have the same pattern because they're managed the same way, is usually 0.7%. So that kind of goes against that idea that, your perennial grasses can build carbon. And that's because in these systems, respiration is at full speed. You're watering it all year round. It's growing most of the year. You're then giving it way excess nitrogen. And this was actually part of a nitrogen trial where we were measuring deep nitrogen and seeing how leaky the system was, again, for the barrier reef funded sort of projects. So you can see here the carbon to nitrogen ratio in these soils is like 7:1, which is chicken manure. So you can see they're hot, they're hyperventilating. So it's very hard to build long-term carbon when your respiration rate is so high, even though it's a perennial grass. Obviously, the key constraint is there's no root volume, as well as the overload of nitrogen probably. So here's sugarcane. It's a little bit of a different crop to other cropping systems. It's very intensive, but it's a 4 or 5 year crop because it's a perennial grass. But after about 5 years, because of soil constraints, the grass runs out of puff, the return crops, they call them, the second and following year crops. So they eventually renovate the paddock and regrow. They have a fallow break of 6 to 12 months and then they'll regrow. So again, the thing about sugarcane fields is they're often not short of organic matter. There's a mountain of organic matter on the surface. There's not always a lot underground because of compaction. The root volumes have shrunk since the 70s when the heavy machinery came on, and that's been their big problem, is low soil organic carbon. So the industry, when it did its 12 years, 13 years research onto why yields were declining, identified soil health as their main barrier. And that's 3 parts to that were soil carbon was disappearing, soil structure, i.e. compaction, and soil-borne diseases. They were the 3 big hammers on the system. And you can see that in the tropics, respiration and breakdown of that organic matter is very high. So in those intensive systems with poor infiltration, etc., no aeration, no root volume, or the root volume's really shrunk. And it's really interesting. I talked to the old cane farmers that remember the pre-large machinery days of the 80s, like back into the 60s and 50s. Their problem was they used to block the tines up with root volume when they were preparing paddocks, and nowadays it's lucky if you have any root volume. And that the work really showed the significant reduction.
So,
yes.
On time, we've got about 3 minutes.
Great. All right, I better scoot. So the key thing here is this is an example of right next to a cane field where they've been able to build organic carbon up to 17% through a forest pattern. And that's because they've stopped the tillage, they've lowered temperature at surface. So it's these things like lowering temperature at surface, which is really important, as well as that infiltration of water, but protecting the surface and lowering temperature reduces that oxidation. This is the new cane systems. This is multi-species cover cropping in cane on controlled traffic. And this is a high legume multi-species. And this farmer here, Alan Lynn's been able to reduce his nitrogen from 180 to 120 units in his cane, and an increase in yield. This is an example for you getting to the business end of it, where Ray's been able, you can see the side-by-side comparison, and it's that root volume and the rhizodisposition and the influence of actively growing roots, because traditional cane will be a bare fallow rather than an active plant growing fallow. And you can see what that does to soil function and soil structure. So it's getting the essentials right, which is obviously minimizing compaction, ground cover, getting living roots in the system, as well as any major soil constraints like compaction or sodium. But the other big thing I think that influences this whole show is lowering the solubility. Solubility, particularly nitrogen, really drives that respiration, as well as probably influencing fine roots. So coming to mycorrhizal fungi, I've probably only got a minute left, so I'll have to go a minute over. Sorry, Guy. This is Simon Matson, who did a Nuffield scholarship. Stuart, you probably know him, and he came back in 2015 and was probably one of the first to grow multi-species in Australia, especially in the cane, but overall. And they were measuring the mycorrhizal fungi in that paddocks, and he was growing sunflowers in with sugarcane at the same time as well. So he was doing a dual crop or companion crop, as well as intercropping, as well as multi-species tactics. They saw a 600% increase in mycorrhizal fungi biomass, and a significant increase in just from adding the seed of the sunflowers, no inoculum, just adding that. So that was Dr. Graham Sterling helping him with that. So I guess the question I have, the questions with mycorrhizal fungi, and similar to the trial that you guys are doing there, is that when we inoculate them, we're seeing these direct effects in the trial work, where the inoculant is helping with plant stress and accessing phosphorus, for example, and probably helping there with the reaggregation of soils to some extent, and what I call the nutrient cycling capacity. But I guess there's these indirect effects of increasing over the longer term root volume, and therefore soil carbon, longer forms of soil carbon in the soil, that I think is still to be teased out in the practical R&D in Australian farming systems. No one's really looked at that next step that I've seen okay, we're getting these initial agronomic benefits, but are we getting these secondary, indirect, longer term soil building, soil carbon building benefits? And I think if you look at the science around the world, there's mixed reports, because it depends a bit on the context. And the same goes for compost. So this is a tropical composter. We get these direct effects, and you see it, this cane farm in particular has seen a significant improvement in nitrogen and structure of the soil. There's definitely direct effects of nutrient, obviously, and carbon to provide the soil organisms, but that may increase respiration rate in the short term. We're also inoculating the soil with those microbes that help us, and some structural effect depending on the amount of compost you put out. But what are the indirect benefits towards root volume and soil carbon in the mid to long term? I think these questions are still really yet to be answered in particularly dryland cropping systems, where the rates that you use compost out, we reuse, is much lower than in horticulture. Here's 200 tonnes per hectare, but I'm going to jump through it. So I guess here's near Wellington on the compost trial that obviously has been going for a few years in the Central West, some of the trials. And these are the questions I have, is what are the direct effects from an agronomic benefit, but then what are those indirect or secondary longer term effects? Can it help trigger that root deposition and root volume deposition that then start to trigger more humus formation? So I really put those, so the agri-inoculums like mycorrhizal fungi or the DSEs and like compost in this category of extras that sort of build on the fundamentals being really building that root volume, and the diversity seems to come into that as well, and the biomass, so that we can create this self-organizing soil system that's optimized for our climate and soil type. Because I think, as Guy's highlighted, it's a community effort. Building soil carbon is not through one pathway. Obviously, there's a liquid carbon pathway and there's a solid carbon pathway, and there's multiple kind of sub-pathways in that. But we're trying to get that soil to really optimize itself for its climate. And that means managing the whole system and I think the mycorrhizal and compost tactics are really just supplements in a lot of the time to that process. So sorry, Guy, I probably try to squeeze way too much in there, but thanks anyway, everyone. I hope that's given you a bit of food for thought.
Thanks, Dave. And it's interesting comparing that. Basically, it's a a faster system up in the tropics, obviously, but the same processes are at play. This respiration versus storage scenario that you're trying to highlight there, that happens rapidly up there and slower down here, but the same process. And it's interesting. I mean, one of the the obvious targets of this research is to tease out what does work and what doesn't work, and apply science to ideas that people are trying. Sometimes you see agronomic benefits, but you may not be gaining soil health benefits that like you think you are, and that's what we hope to do in this trial, to actually have a really good look at what's happening there and whether we're getting some gains. So to dig a little bit deeper, thanks very much, David. We'll go over to Justin and Wolfram. Someone probably needs to be on mute there. So Justin and Wolfram have been working with us on, as I said earlier, on looking at the fractions of carbon and why it's important to look at the fractions. So we might go over to Wolfram to actually explain what that actually means, the different fractions, what they are, how they're measured, and then Justin might tease out the bigger picture of where we're tracking with that. Over to you, Wolfram.
Sorry, I just need to find the presentation. It is. Okay, so I hope you guys can hear me. I modified the presentation a bit while David was talking. I thought I tried to tie in what he said a little ago into a bit more depth. So this is sort of an overview of how basically soil carbon is formed. So starting on the left side here with CO2 going into the plant, being fixed by the plant, and then some of that carbon is respired, so it's lost again, while part of that is allocated below ground, and roots are formed, and part of that carbon is then exudated, or specifically rhizodeposition is bringing carbon into the soil. And again, there's some loss directly from the roots, and then some loss of those rhizodeposits that are then decomposed by microorganisms. So this is basically the brown pathway here is lost by the plant, and the red one is lost by microorganisms. And part of that is stabilized in soil. So this is one pathway, the liquid carbon pathway, and then we have this sort of solid carbon pathway, where we have the crop residues on the soil, where a lot of the carbon is lost quite quickly, and then parts of that is stabilized again in soil. And we're getting now to those three main carbon pools, and one of those is particulate organic matter, and that's sort of the transition from shoot biomass or also roots, so from residues, plant material, into the more stable carbon pools. And then we have two stable carbon pools. One is carbon in aggregates, so essentially occluded in aggregates, which protects it from oxidation, protects it from really microorganisms from decomposition. And then we have mineral-associated organic matter, and that is really the most stable carbon in soil. And that is when really small dissolved organic carbon absorbs to mineral surfaces, which again protects it from microorganisms, so they simply can't access that carbon, and it is protected. And now I'll just go. So a guy was asking whether we can go into the lab, and to show that it's a bit tricky at the moment still with lockdown, so we're working from home. But yeah, so the idea of this fractionation is really that you start with, you sieve the soil, so everything above 2 millimeter is sieved out, and that's could be plant roots as well, could be sort of larger parts from crop residues, and that is not considered soil carbon as such. And then we have a partial disaggregation of that soil with sort of a gentle shaking, and then we sieve that soil and have everything that's, in this case, I use 70 micron, but that's 50 micron, 53, 63 micron, there's various cutoffs there. And then I do a density separation. So basically a high density liquid where I separate out everything that's really low density, that's floating. And this is this recently plant-derived particulate organic matter. And I have a picture on the next slide really showing that it's still, you can still see the plant fragments in there. And then the dense material is the aggregate carbon, and everything that's below 70 micron is either material that is dissolved in water, or it's material that is carbon that's sorbing really tightly to those mineral surfaces. So that's essentially, we've got 4 pools here now. The dissolved organic carbon pool is really a very, very small pool, more sort of a transition between different states, between different pools.
So would that be sugars and things like plant sugars and so on?
Exactly, yeah. Plant sugars, anything really that can dissolve, that can be simply the transition, because if you decompose organic matter, there are lots of different compounds formed, and that are then really low molecular weight, they can dissolve in water.
Yeah.
I unfortunately, I didn't find too many photos. I checked my phone, and those are the only ones I could find. So essentially, you're starting with tubes where we shake the soil, and then we've got here, this is the particulate organic matter, which basically, so you separate it from this high density liquid. And then here on the right, this is the picture I really wanted to show, where you can see this is considered soil organic carbon, because this is basically below this 2 millimeter cutoff, but it's still plant derived. And so you really can see those plant fragments in there. And if you have this fraction, basically a lot of this is still going to be lost on the pathway to more stable carbon pools. And that's why this is sort of the importance. This is what I want to stress in this talk, that this is the fraction that, yes, you can build up quite quickly by putting crop residues on the soil, but it can also be lost quite quickly again. And here just a little bit sort of how that's then presented. Essentially, you have those 3 different carbon pools. And so, for example, here in this soil, you have 1% total carbon, and then you have around 0.2% of that is particulate organic matter. What's that? 0.5 or so is aggregate carbon, and the rest is mineral associated. And then there are other soils where this just shifts.
So, Wolfram, what's the actual physical force that's when you say mineral associated organic carbon?
Mm-hmm.
What's that word associated mean? Is it is an electric bond, or how's it?
All sorts. So yes, an electronic bond. That's basically, so it's essentially a physical sorption process. So it's not in that sense a chemical conversion or so, but it is something that's reversible. So in that sense, it's not something that is it is a long-term stable carbon pool, but it can be reversed, this sorption process. For example, by adding extra low molecular weight carbon into the soil. I don't want to go into that, that's too much, but essentially it can mean that some of that carbon is then again used by microorganisms, and that's basically then dissolving that from mineral surfaces.
So broadly speaking, what would the different time periods, the residence time for the different carbon pools you've got there be?
Yeah, the question I prefer not to answer, but because it's essentially, let's say probably for aggregate carbon, and I have a slide on that, so it can be lost quickly. The mineral associated organic carbon pool is usually like on decades, but the problem is there is turnover, so you might have loss of some of that mineral associated, but also new formation as well again. So it's essentially it's really difficult to put really numbers on that, because the soil is just so variable. Like if you look at the tropics, the turnover, it's just so much quicker compared to the dryland area. So yeah, unfortunately, it's really tricky to put numbers on that.
That none of those pools are like locked away forever.
Exactly.
Got different exposure to going back up as carbon dioxide.
That's exactly it. So here, this is just showing a little bit of temporal variability, and on the next slide I also have spatial variability. The next slide I also have temporal variability. So just sort of the summary on the right. So the particulate organic matter pool can be formed quite quickly, but it can also be lost quite quickly. And then the aggregate carbon is sort of a pool in between, semi-stable, and typically follows this particulate organic matter pool, but with a bit less fluctuations. And then the mineral associated is really sort of the stable carbon pool, the long-term stable carbon pool. with less sort of spatial and temporal variability. And essentially, if you just look at the numbers here, the particulate organic matter really is a large variability in there spatially. Mineral associated, there's far less variability. So just from 0.4 to 0.6, here from 0.1 to 0.3, so 3 times variability here, it's just around like 50% or so. Yeah, just one more slide on this. This is really just now showing that there is temporal variability in those pools. So it's just a different site again, where you have those 3 pools. First, in September 2020, really good year, so a mid time point, and basically quite likely a lot of formation. Unfortunately, I don't have a baseline before this sort of good year. But what happened is then that in May 2021, so a lot of that carbon particulate organic matter in XC was both, a lot of that was lost again. And that's quite likely because it was a good year, which means there's a lot of formation, but a good year also means there's a lot of microbial activity. So that's why this carbon can also be lost again. And that's why you always need the sort of baseline just before the sort of a good year starts, and then pretty much a year later to see really the difference. The difference within a year is then giving you that build up, that formation.
Really,
yeah, just this is basically the soil carbon. And just the last slide I want to finish up with, that there's also a different type of carbon, and that is charcoal or biochar, which is essentially not part of this sort of classic soil carbon. It's essentially a really different chemical composition, and that gives it recalcitrance against decomposition by microorganisms. It essentially means this process, you have a lot of sort of initial carbon loss, but then the carbon that you retain in biochar and charcoal is then retained in soil really well. Here at the bottom is just one of the soil samples that I had, where I then separated out the charcoal, which basically, but you can clearly see that it's not this classic particulate organic matter, but it's black. It's clearly. I think I'll hand over to Justin.
Thanks, Wolfram. Can you guys hear me all right?
Yep, coming through well, Justin.
All right, let's see. So I've got I got my cartoon intro slide up. Thanks, Wolfram, for the details on the carbon fractionation and the pathways, liquid carbon pathway, and David and Stuart. So let me try and take us home here, and then we can have a nice discussion. It's been a good day. So I thought I'd put this point up front because regenerative agriculture is getting lots of press. The pendulum's kind of swinging back, that might be overhyped right now. And what is regenerative agriculture anyway? A lot of us proponents, it's everything to everybody and let's regenerate the world. But what does that really mean? And I think if we flip it around and talk about agricultural regeneration as the outcome, that's a better way of thinking about it. It's the results. Regeneration is each year your field's improving, your carbon is increasing, your water holding capacity, your nutrient cycling, rather than a label or a method that would or would not work everywhere, every time. It's a process. So I'd just like to introduce that to start. And then let's put this in kind of in a hierarchy of benefits, because we hear about all these benefits from different sectors. Where farming community and agriculture resilience might be at the top. We'd like to improve yields, of course, and regenerating degraded lands can improve yields, but as the climate gets worse, and even though we've had a couple of great seasons, we came off of a record drought, and we'll probably go back to that. We shouldn't kid ourselves or forget too quickly. And so it's really about yield stability and resilience to bounce back in these good years and then withstand the rough years. And soil health is a big part of that. And soil health, I think, comes before soil carbon. We need to think about these cycles that Wolfram, it's not so bad to lose carbon from your soil if you're putting more in, than you're getting out, then that's on net a big benefit. And we'll talk in detail about carbon stocks and flows at the end, because there is sort of a divide. The other thing, of course, is that we don't need to go wall to wall monocultures. It's great to hear people talking about cover crops and breaks between sugarcane or wheat. And as we're getting erratic rainfalls, then having more soil moisture can allow us to extend the growing seasons. But shelter belts are another way of hedging your bets in space as well as time. And I know Guy's a big proponent of fodder crops and alley farming, and could be larger or smaller shelter belts, but we can integrate agriculture into a broader ecosystem, and we can get certificates in biodiversity habitat for some of these shelter belts, reduce wind speed and evaporation, which holds the moisture in the ground, at least shifts that evaporation, which is really just a loss back to the atmosphere, toward transpiration, which is the water going out through a leaf. And then when water goes out through a leaf, it can pull carbon in. So that's the photosynthesis is really, benefiting from improved water use efficiency, which has a lot to do with the layout of the farm. And of course, the ground cover increases the infiltration as well, so we have less runoff. And Stuart talked about that. Now it all kind of comes together, or we're getting a lot of long overdue excitement from the climate community, because we need to hit net zero. And what does net mean? That means we're going to reduce emissions and increase the sequestration. And for agriculture, we have certainly emissions to reduce, especially in the intensive cropping, probably the over-fertilization and the runoff that David was talking about. But we can go beyond that, and we can increase the drawdown and sequester carbon in the vegetation, in the soil, the transient soil carbon, but also in the long-term fractions that Wolfram was talking about. So these are the orders, the priorities that I put it in, that we can build agricultural resilience, number one, because the climate's going to get worse before it gets better. In the best case, we're coming through probably the hardest, more turbulent decades that humanity's ever faced. In the best case, we can take a little step back and try to build in this physical resilience, and ultimately that addresses the kind of global issues. Now, we also should remember that we think and track carefully all the fossil fuel emissions. We're starting to now, with satellites, do a better job at tracking land clearing emissions. And agriculture, we do have to blame ourselves a little bit indirectly. Forests are getting cut down for agricultural expansion. And so those are the sources of carbon to the atmosphere, but the land sector is pulling down more than a quarter of our pollution each year, and we're not getting credit for that. I mean, this is the base functions of the ecosystems, mostly the big forests in the Amazon. I'll show you in a minute. But we'd like to think agriculture, which is half of the planet, could be a big part of this drawdown solution. And the oceans are another one. Some of that is just dissolved CO2 and could bubble back out. But we need to work on ocean sinks as well. And right now, the land and the ocean are cleaning up about half of our emissions. So this isn't such a novel thing to talk about, even doubling the existing drawdown. We got to take, give credit already. Now, what happens in the world carbon cycle is that these industrial processes, we're talking, electric cars and better efficient solar wind. But really the other side is the land use side. So it's about energy and land. And agriculture at the moment is a part of the problem, both directly and indirectly with the land use change, but it's also a big part of the solution. So we'd like to shift. Agriculture can go below zero. It's not about reducing emissions. It's also about sequestration.
Is that your headphones buzzing there, Justin?
Is it coming back now or not? Is that any better?
It might be better. Oh, no, it's still there. Might be something else. That's all right.
Sorry about that. Yeah, so look, here's one way of thinking about it. This is the gross photosynthesis. It's 10 times larger than human emissions, but it's a cycle. And the plants use their energy at night to live and grow. And the root heterotrophic respiration, and these microbes release it all. So the living cycle is an order of magnitude larger than human emissions. And we need to enhance that with better water and nutrient balance for improved photosynthesis, ground cover, cover crops, integrating a few trees here and there will improve the drawdown capacity, and then we need to reduce the losses. So Wolfram started to talk about biochar, a way of making the above ground residues more permanent, which also improves soils and nutrient and water holding capacity. And then, a topic for today's discussion is the soil health and the soil microbes. We're not going to, completely remove those soil losses, but we can reduce them by minimum till and other balancing approaches, such as the right microbes, soil health, the right balance of fertilizers. And then we need to reduce our fossil fuel emissions as well. Here's another picture that I always like to show, which just gives you that space and time in the biological carbon cycle. We zoom in on Australia, we can see that the center is not dead. We do get a few good years where there's some background productivity, and the real advantage is both in the temperate regions, but also in the tropical regions in complementary seasons. So it cycles around. Now, what this means in practice is that we want to do the best job we can at capturing solar energy, thinking about the seasonal cycles, ground cover, and trees for light capture. In the cold months, we are energy limited in cold climates like Canberra, but usually we're water limited. So it has a lot to do with improving some of the physical characteristics, but mostly this shift from reducing evaporation to increasing the transpiration and infiltration and re-meandering streams and rehydrating the landscapes to really enhance this water cycle with an enhanced water cycle and nutrient cycle, because especially nitrogen flows in the water. So we want to think about these inputs to plants because that becomes the input to the carbon cycle. And the above ground is for capture, below ground for storage. And there's these physical processes, which I'll come to, about making the biological carbon more stable in a geological form. The design is really important. We want to move away from kind of crops or pasture or forest plantation blocks to more integrated, mixed use, resilient systems, agroforestry, cover crops, rotation, grazing, integration. And we can do this in a very high resolution approach where we think about not only the way evaporation, and we can model the solar energy very accurately. We can actually look at runoff and infiltration quite accurately and get a good handle on the spatial temporal dynamics of the nutrient cycles. So that can allow us to build these precision farm systems. So the goal is to kind of do this at the paddock scale. We'd like to think about pixels that are probably a hectare or so, and hundreds of millions of hectares in Australia have the potential for regeneration. That's mostly the cropping and intensive grazing land, but also some rangeland pixels that do get enough rain that we can really turbocharge this, this opportunity. So stacking the different layers, we want to obviously protect the good soils and the good habitats. Restoring some is largely what our carbon farming is about in this country. Kind of walk away and let it recover. But going beyond, adding the design for rehydration to get the moisture into the ground when we do have it, because there'll be more intense rains separated by intense droughts. And Australia is really world leading in dealing with dynamic, let's call it, agriculture. Getting the nutrient balance right, not overdoing it, not starving the plants either. And that can be biological approaches or, some direct nutrient applications, and weathered rocks is also really important in there. And together, this is kind of a regeneration system. So we'd like to get that yield up. And there's a lot of opportunity in Australia, which I think is being recognized overseas with our land price kind of skyrocketing recently. And carbon prices are way up around the world, and Australia is a little bit behind the curve. I think the foreign bodies are recognizing it faster than we are. So let me finish with the last couple thoughts. We want to integrate the above ground vegetation, what I talked about, the below ground soil piece that we heard, especially Wolfram and his new methods for quickly quantifying soil carbon in its various forms. And we're going to tack on, once you've got soil in a tube, you can extract the DNA, and we can look easily now at the sequences of the microbes, track where they're going, verify that the inoculation is working. That's something we've done recently, which is this biological loop. Above and below ground, that's biological. And we're mostly thinking there about these flows from photosynthesis through to respiration, with some percentage, maybe we can get up to 10% of the carbon is sticking around. And then complementary, we'd like to accelerate the recalcitrants, fixing the biomass into forms that won't break down, which is, making coal in our lifetime through pyrolysis, as Wolfram mentioned. Half of the carbon, is used to make the other half permanent, but that's a lot better than 90% of it breaking down. And that holds water and absorbing, nutrient absorbing potential into the soil. So chop and char kind of idea. And the other geological tool for making carbon permanent is enhanced rock weathering. This is starting to get more attention now, especially around, the potential for alkalinity to run off into the Great Barrier Reef. So young basalt lava rocks, when they weather, when the root activity breaks down and releases calcium and magnesium, that alkalinity then increases the pH and sequesters carbon. You're accelerating the natural carbonate cycle. This rock weathering happens naturally. It takes about a gigaton of CO2 out every year around the world, but we've got a great mining capacity in this country, so we could double that, triple that even. So the last slide is to try to, this is from Feroza, new postdoc in the group, that's trying to put all of these precision agricultural systems into a model. Keep eye out for DASIM, a dynamic agroecological simulator, where we track both the stocks and the flows of water and carbon. And the nice example that people use a lot for stocks and flows is the flow is the water coming out of the pipe into your bathtub, and it's going to be leaking out again when the leaves drop and rot, or when the soil microbes release that carbon. We want to reduce the losses, increase the gains. So those are the two biological flows that we're trying to manage. And what happens is, if you reduce the losses and increase the gains, you're going to fill the bathtub. And these are the stocks. So that's the way we model, right? The stock is what the geologists want to sell on a carbon market, but the flows are what we want in biology and agriculture for the nutrient cycles and the water cycles and the carbon cycles. And so that's how they're related. All right, let's stop there, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Justin. Good on you. So I guess we have actually run overtime by a bit, but that's not unusual for a SoilCQuest meeting. So I understand if people have to drop off, that's fine, but we haven't had our forum panel as yet. So if people want to stick around for the next 10 minutes or so, we'll open the floor up for questions to the speakers here today. Any burning questions people like to have. Just, I guess, a bit of a summary of what we've seen here today. Just jotted down a couple of the statements, and there seemed to be this common theme of this stock and lock versus the grow and flow. So developing systems that actually keep flowing the carbon into the system, and the bits that stick and stay, that's good. But you've got to keep the system going to actually make it so the carbon will stay in the system. So, and that fed really nicely into Justin's statement at the start of his talk, was that agricultural regeneration, regenerative ag, it's more an outcome rather than a process or a method. So it's something that happens when you adopt certain processes, you get regenerative outcomes. I think that's a great way that feeds back into that idea of grow and flow. So we might see if we've got any questions from the audience, and feel free to ask any of the panelists or each other for that matter, any questions that might be burning on the tip of your mind at the moment. Steph, I'm not sure whether you've got access to the questions your end, have you? That pop up?
Yes. If you just pop the questions into chat or raise your hand.
Yeah, sorry, I should have said that. Yeah. Yep.
Okay, so we have one from Jen. She says, "Hi, David. You mentioned 17% carbon in the soil in one of the farms in tropical Queensland. Is there a point where the carbon levels are so high that there's no more benefit to biomass increase to the farmer?"
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's something that I've been thinking about for a long time, because obviously you can build a peat soil, which is what they almost did. I say almost because it doesn't function like a peat soil, which is a high carbon soil. But you can go beyond the functional level of carbon that you need, and that usually turns into a peat soil, which doesn't have a great nutrient cycling dynamic, if that makes sense for agriculture. So that particular example is an old cane field that was bought for vanilla farming, and they just started mulching the vanilla beds because vanilla is an orchid that needs a forest soil. So they didn't know how much carbon they would build. They knew they had to mulch the soil. So the cane fields will have 1% carbon if they're lucky nearby, 30 meters away. And this soil ended up at about 16, 17%. And yes, the problem was that they were using very high lignin type material initially from rainforest prunings from council. And it started to switch to what they call a peat soil up there. And in that situation with 4 meters of rain, you'll end up with a bog and a marsh. So they started to bring in more legume content to the mulch and green leaves, and they found that completely changed the dynamic of the quality of that organic matter. So it drained, it had structure, it didn't act as a kind of swampy bog. But yeah, in my opinion, there's a threshold at which for agriculture I need a certain amount for that whole soil system to work, but do I need more? There's a sweet spot, I guess, would be the answer.
So, David, that nitrogen content made a big difference to...
Yeah, it was fascinating, Guy, because everyone's really aware of the tropical peat soils because they're quite problematic to manage when they clear them. When they cleared them for cane, they're very challenging soils. They have a high carbon content, but their C to N ratio, they're just difficult. And so they were really concerned. The grower, Fiona George is the name, she was really concerned that she would flip it into a peat soil, which was a valid concern. And yeah, so it was this quality of that material. The other thing really interesting from an agronomic point of view is the cation balancing, and the pH is like spot on. Neil Kinsey would be having, kittens, and yet she's never put any minerals out, whereas the cane fields have to lime religiously because the pH drops it. Well, you look away and it'll drop 2 units because it's just 4 meters and it's acid forming soil. So it's really interesting how that kind of self-equilibrium came in as well without any, lime or gypsum or any soil amendments in that regard.
No, it was just relevant for last week's seminar at Luke Woods, and we were talking about a cropping with arrowleaf clover with canola and that natural nitrogen.
I remember that. Yeah.
That organic carbon and the agronomic impact on the soil health.
Well, that's what I wrote down. My question for the group was along those lines from your carbon economy thing. And I think we've got to remember that economy has a few different currencies, and nitrogen's flowing along next to that carbon, and so is water. And I think, we've kind of got these other two hidden, they're not hidden, but these other two markets, if you like. So I think when we're managing carbon flows or that carbon economy, it's not just the carbon, it's also the nitrogen and water that we're managing, because they're all interlinked, obviously. So yeah, I think that's really important.
Yep, great.
Mick Wettenhall, you've got your hand up. Do you have a question?
David, yeah, thanks for that, mate. That was great, your presentation. There's a couple of things there. That 17% increase that you saw there? What sort of time frame are we talking?
11 years, mate. It's the most famous soil in Queensland, I can tell you. Soil scientists rock up there and they just can't believe it, but we've got all the numbers and the tests. Yeah, it was a 17%. And the Queensland, North Queensland soil scientist for the DPI, he's measured soil carbon in rainforests, and things like that for many years. And high fertility soil type rainforests can get close to that if they're intact and there's canopy cover and big leaf litter layer and all that, and cool at surface. But yeah, it's quite phenomenal. But again, it's the load in, the high amount of mulching every year, but they also put shade cloth over the top, to create a forest environment. So they cooled the surface. It's probably 8 to 10 degrees hotter 20 meters away in the cane field than it is there. So those things are really important, I think, and no disturbance. There's, the cane guys, the traditional cane guys will use a rotary hoe at least 4 times in the renovation. So you've got a lot of tillage. So you can see the very difference in the management.
Yeah, no, and that's the other thing that stuck out to me from your talk. I haven't had much to do with that deal. I assumed that sort of country up there, even though a lot of it is quite sandy, that there would have higher carbon levels given the amount of biomass we're talking. But to be sub 1% soil carbon, and your slide with the Rhodes grass that's 0.7 and jacked out with urea. I mean, the other one that blew me away. That's one of the methodologies they're saying that we can use is go from annual to perennial, and to have a perennial grass like that at 0.7 just shows the deleterious effect of urea.
And compaction. So no root volume because that continual traffic, and cutting it really short as well. So they're cutting it too short because of the machinery, so there's the perennial grass doesn't have time to rebuild root reserves or maintain root reserves. It's a combination of all of those things. Because subtropical grasses, Dr. Rob Banks' work in northern New South Wales showed you can turn cropping country, increase 3 or 4% carbon level in over a reasonable time frame when you switch it back to subtropicals. So it's I guess a different pattern again. It's all about the context, isn't it? The sum of everything you're doing.
Yeah.
There's some basic principles to adhere to there, isn't there? Like the amount of carbon that is actually going physically into the soil in root mass, the nitrogen carbon ratio, so the form of nitrogen. So as Mick alluded to, there's lots of research nowadays on synthetic nitrogen, particularly urea, more like spinning your wheels and helping to actually build carbon. You burn it faster than you make it with synthetic nitrogen, so getting that legume nitrogen into the system, but you still got to get the carbon into the system. You've still got to physically somehow grow carbon and put it in the system. But we might get you down to Stuart's place for next year's trials, and we'll work out how we can get his paddocks up to 17% next year.
Put a shade cloth over it.
Well, no matter what you do, though, at the end of the day, 17% in 10 or 11 years, like as an enterprise, even that $26 where it's at the minute, it dwarfs anything. Like
$36 spot price last week.
Huh?
$36 a tonne spot price last week.
Yeah.
So obviously you've got a much higher rainfall. You're talking a 4 metre rainfall, but they can have a problem. They often get too much rainfall. Those cane guys. They can grow biomass, but the warmth and the rainfall, the respiration, the bugs, the bacteria breakdown's massive.
Yeah.
Just looking at the time, we might just take one last question. I think Justin's been kind enough to go into chat and answer a few questions there. There's just one last one from Jennifer West, who missed the first part of the session and just wanted to ask, does anyone have experience of incorporating biochar into agricultural soils?
It'd be for you, Wolfram, would it?
Well, I guess it's more experience of actually someone doing it in practice. I'm the researcher, but sure. I mean, so I think that the difficulty with that is at the moment still sort of the production units are usually quite expensive. So to get really that amount of biochar that you need in terms of converting your crop residues, that's something that, I don't think people really do it in agriculture yet as sort of a carbon sequestration method. They do it, for example, to produce a biochar fertilizer from it, that then you apply in much smaller amounts onto your soil, but less so at the moment. It's sort of more of an economy of scale thing. for really for crop residues for large scale carbon sequestration. But certainly, hopefully, we're on track to manage that eventually.
The problem I've seen is in the economics. There was a project out of Dubbo where they were going to turn all the organic waste and feedlot manures and everything into biochar. The economics on it was about $400 a tonne of biochar ex Dubbo. And then you got to put it in a truck and get it out to farm, and then you got to put it in a spreader and spread it out on the paddock, or find some way of putting it under the ground. And we had big trouble trying to get the economics to work on that scale, and that was done, at a pretty big scale. The scoping for that. So there might be cheaper ways to do it now. I'm not sure, but this is going back a few years now. But that's a perennial problem with the biochar on broadacre, I guess, is how do you do it cheap enough to get it out there. That's probably we have now. We're getting worse and worse. We're only 10 minutes late last time. Now we're 20 minutes late this one. That's typical field day stuff, I guess. There's always some people hanging around a field day long after the speakers have gone and walking through the crops. So situation normal, really. But I'd really like to thank the speakers, Stuart, David, Justin and Wolfram. Also the questions that came onto the floor, that was excellent. I had better not forget our sponsors as well. So Dan Nicholson from Topsoil Organics supplied, I think it was 2 B doubles of compost to Stuart's operation. 3, there you go. So that was really good of them. They make an excellent compost here at Forbes on Scarp. And also Sumitomo Chemicals donated the Endoprime product, which is a mycorrhizal inoculum, one of the better ones on the market. So that Jock Lees was good enough to donate that. We'll keep them in the loop of how the trials work out and so on. So thanks very much for that, and thanks very much for our broader supporters with the Australian Government, Department of Ag and Water and Environment, the Ian Potter Foundation, obviously the ANU, and all the land carers that have been really supportive over the years as well. So thanks very much. Thanks for being patient, and please tell your friends next Wednesday, the 20th, same time, same station for our last one. We've got a few good speakers again coming. One of them not so sure of, because that's me. But I'll be presenting on some new projects that SoilCQuest is angling at. But we'll also have Noel Blair coming on to give us a real high-level overview of the carbon and biodiversity markets that are evolving in Australia. There's lots of talk on social media, and every newspaper you open just about there's something about the carbon market and the biodiversity market and the massive opportunities that are there for us all. We're going to put that in a bit of context. Niall's all over it from that point of view, to actually give us an international scope down to a national scope of what this market actually looks like going forward in the next 10 years and what the opportunities really are for farmers to enter into those markets and try to drive this regenerative outcomes that we're all looking for. So thanks very much for everyone for coming. Excellent turnout. Hope to see you all here next week for another fun-packed adventure of carbon building systems with carbon calling. Thanks very much.
Take care.